Hi, everybody. It's Steve here, and I got my buddy Dunsky here. And for those of you who don't know him, Dun was the very first executive producer of The Agenda, and he has written an article about China for the Literary Review of Canada, which I thought was a very fascinating piece. And so I thought, what the heck? I'm going to call him up on this Zoom call, and I'm going to just talk to him a little bit about his piece. And then we'll put this thing up on social media, and everybody can hear all about it. Dun, first of all, how are you managing through the pandemic?
So far, so good. So far, so good. I mean, I can't complain.
Good. Glad to hear it. Your piece is called China's Moment, Reckoning with an Empire State of Mind. And I just want to read the first paragraph of it just so people can get a sense of where you're coming from.
Sure.
You write, let's start with a hypothetical. It's early 2022. Countries around the world are beginning to recover from nearly 2 years of social distancing, illness, and a shocking amount of death. Mass vaccination for COVID-19 has been underway globally for several months, and gradually, carefully, people are emerging from their isolation to a more normal rhythm to their lives. Okay, that sets the scene. What kind of China do you imagine the world will have to deal with under this future scenario that you have just outlined there?
Well, thanks for reading that, Steve. At a point about a couple of months ago, I was walking around the neighborhood and we were in the middle of this pandemic and the worst part of it here in Ontario. And I was thinking to myself, if China were thinking strategically and they were thinking, how do we take advantage of this situation? Because remember, this a few months ago, we're still seeing it now, of course, the United States response has been disastrous. And China seemed to have kind of slowed its curve more quickly than other countries. So I was thinking about, wouldn't it be interesting if China were to kind of launch a modern day or a contemporary equivalent of the Marshall Plan to help countries that have been devastated, whose economies have been devastated by the pandemic, to get back on their feet. And it's a hypothetical, and it's a kind of you can have fun with it and do a bit of counterfactual history. But if we think forward, there's not that I imagine that China will launch a Marshall Plan, and in the piece I kind of tongue-in-cheek named it after the doctor who first rang the alarm bells about COVID-19 or the coronavirus in China, and subsequently died, but not before being pilloried by the Communist Party of China, the Chinese Communist Party. And so I just had a little bit of fun with that hypothetical, but used it as a way to paint a picture of a rising China, which we all know, and how this could be a bit of a hinge moment for China, especially given the mess that we see going on in the United States. So I lay that out and I look and see, the article kind of it paints a picture of how China is doing right now in the snapshot in this moment in time. And it juxtaposes that against what's going on in the United States, and then asks the question, and I remember I wrote this prior to the two Michaels, Spaver and Kovrig, being formally arrested, and prior to our Prime Minister's response to that yesterday, but discussed a bit about how Canada can approach this very difficult period for it.
Okay, lots to unpack there. So and you know what, first of all, there may be some young people watching this right now, or people who don't know what the Marshall Plan is because they don't remember post-World War II. So take 30 seconds and just remind everybody what the Marshall Plan was.
After World War II, the United States, under the leadership of General George Marshall, and really under President Truman, undertook a vast financial plan called the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. Enormous amounts of American capital was poured into Western Europe, especially into Germany, West Germany, France, and Italy, to help build those shattered economies. And it was seen as a template for how to not only rebuild and help allies, but to extend American influence around the world.
And the theory being, unlike after the end of World War I, we're not going to punish the people we defeated this time. We're going to help rebuild them, become allies with them, and the world will be a better place for it. And that, in fact, has happened.
That's exactly what happened. Bring them into the fold.
Okay. Now, if China wanted to do a kind of Marshall Plan post-pandemic, should we in the West have a problem with that?
Well, okay. So again, it was tongue-in-cheek, the idea of them doing a Marshall Plan. But there is reason to believe, well, we're already seeing China spend an enormous amounts of money around the world strategically. So China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, which is a massive infrastructure investment program that currently is funding and developing projects in about 70 countries around the world. Now, it has a bit of a sketchy record, and that's foreign direct investment, right? So direct investments building rail, building roads, developing ports, helping infrastructure in countries that China wants to increase trade with and wants to deepen its strategic ties to. That's number one. We're also seeing China extend its reach globally through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, which is China-led alternative, a China-led alternative to the World Bank. So there is already quite a bit of evidence that China is seeking to use its vast wealth, and again, not per capita wealth, but its total wealth, to further its interests. Now, I would add, that's what you would expect a great power to do. I don't see this as some kind of nefarious plot, right? China seeks to regain the position that it had for most of recorded history. In fact, it's only in the last 150, perhaps 200 years that China, vis-a-vis the West, has declined. For most of recorded history, China was the wealthiest, the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful, the most influential country that the world has ever seen. And it's not a surprise that China would seek to rebuild that, that sense of importance and to regain the global position that it once had. So I'll answer your question. Should we see it as a nefarious, a nefarious event? Well, you know, the question really is, what is it that China is seeking to export? What set of values or what set of beliefs is China seeking to export? And right now, it's a bit hard to tell. There's no question that China wants to increase its influence and in the world, and wants to have a seat at the most important tables in the world, as it should. The problem is that the regime, the Communist Party in China right now, is highly problematic, right? This is not, if we still believe in in the West, what we used to call the West, and Western values, and we believe in the rule of law, and we believe in liberal institutions, which I know have come under a lot of strain lately, I'm not naive, then yes, we should have a problem with the influence that China is exerting, insofar as it is directly it counters the beliefs and the values that we seek to see ascendant in the world.
Well, if there is a new world order coming, and China is going to be obviously an increasingly important part of that, I guess my follow-up question is, do you think China wants to participate in the writing of the new rules for this new world order, or do you think they want to dictate and say, here's how it's going to be?
That's a great question, and we don't know the answer to that. This is the $64,000 question that a lot of people are scratching their heads about. Does China want to become part of a new developed global order where it is one of several poles of power, alongside presumably the United States, perhaps the European Union, perhaps Russia? Or does China, as great powers have in the past, seek to create the global order in its image? And we just don't know. Right now, China does not have the power, nor frankly does it have it certainly doesn't have the hard power, nor frankly does it have yet the wealth to be able to become a hegemon, right? So it does appear that where we are headed right now is either towards a bipolar world order, with the United States and China increasingly having to work together to figure out what the rules of the road are, or a multipolar world order with the other powers that I mentioned earlier. And it is still too soon to tell. We also don't know if you think about a great power is a country that has the means and the know-how to project its will on a global scale. We don't know. I think it's an open question as to whether or not China has that kind of global ambition. Does it see Does it see in its history and in its values a universal philosophy for everyone, or is it content to say this is how China operates, and if you want to work with us, you have to adapt to us? I don't know that China seeks to impose its views of the world on others necessarily, but it certainly is. It has given every indication that it is going to be part of the club that makes the rules of the road going forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, I gather part of the success of the Chinese Communist Party is the fact that it has managed to bring, I think I remember these numbers from your piece, the poverty rate in China going back a few decades was 90%, and today it's 2%. So authoritarian communism has done a terrific job of bringing people who were desperately poor out of that poverty and creating new wealth in the country. So the deal was, you give up freedom, you let us have the monopoly of power, and your standard of living will continue to rise. The question is, how much has the pandemic affected the Chinese people's confidence in the Chinese Communist Party's continuing right to govern?
When you get the answer to that question, be sure to let me know, because it is extremely difficult to get that kind of information out of China, as you know. I mean, it is not a country that has a robust, vibrant, free press. Social media is tightly monitored, even though it is extremely active. There are certainly plenty of indications that there's a lot of it's impossible for me to say a lot or many, because we just don't know. There are plenty of indications that some Chinese people, how many I do not know, have expressed extreme displeasure at the way that their government has handled the pandemic. Mm-hmm. There is also quite a bit of evidence, though, that the Chinese government has used this to further its own nationalism and its own nationalist aims, right? So you've seen a ratcheting up of language and war of words with the United States, for instance. It remains to be seen. The challenge is that by arrogating unto itself so much power, the Communist Party of China has no one to blame but itself if things go really wrong. For the moment, it does seem that the government has managed to contain at a huge cost the worst of the pandemic. That is, if we go by the numbers that we see. And it remains to be seen whether or not in this particular instance, the individual Chinese people, insofar as they can express dissent, will be satisfied with their government's actions.
Now, you asked this question in your piece, so I will ask it of you. Why should Canadians care how undemocratic China is?
Right. So, the all-important Canadian question. So if you come back to the original conceit that I had, so let's say that China launches this so-called Marshall Plan. I asked the question, would Western countries whose economies have been hard hit by the pandemic take the money? And, we've seen already some indication that certain Western European countries, Italy among them, are willing to increase their exposure to the Chinese government in terms of loans. So it's not just in Asia and other developing parts of the world. We have seen the so-called developed world turn to China right now to help with their fiscal situations, countries in the Western world. I was asking the question not necessarily because Canada finds itself in such a dire financial or fiscal situation right now, although it's pretty bad, but more because what we are seeing right now is a shifting of the pieces on the chessboard, right? Canada looks south, where we have had important economic, security, and political relationships with the United States. And right now we see a highly problematic administration in the Trump administration. We see a country that seems to be, right now at least, abandoning quite a few of the values that that Canadians believe in. At the same time, Canadians increasingly express dissatisfaction in cozying up to China, as it were, right? So,
well, particularly since they're holding two of our people,
right? The two Michaels. And as I mentioned off the top, I wrote this piece before the latest developments in that. By the way, I should mention that I was very heartened to see the Prime Minister's response yesterday, where the Prime Minister essentially he disagreed with the idea. He said no to the idea that he would trade Meng Wanzhou's freedom for the two Michaels. As difficult a decision as that is, or as that was, and I'm sure it was a very difficult decision, I believe it was the right decision. Canada is caught in this position where we see a rising China, and we see an increasingly fickle partner in the United States, certainly in the form of the Trump administration. Should Canada hitch its wagon or hedge its bets a little bit more towards China? That's a very tough one, right? Because we see a country now. We see a country that increasingly behaves in ways that in China that we find odious. I mean, we certainly find quite a few things that the Trump administration is doing as being odious as well. And this is a very delicate time for Canada, right? Our relationship with the United States, which is a very close, special relationship and is the source of an enormous part of this country's wealth, is on fragile ground. And on the other hand, we're aware that there come certain challenges in further developing a relationship with China. So I come down on the side of saying that we have to do everything that we can to encourage the United States to remember the kind of liberal antecedents of its founding, and hope that, and hope I know is not a strategy, but hope that the Americans vote out the Trump administration in this fall's election. But even then, I don't think that, I do think that it's important for Canadians to think very hard and very long about the short to medium term world that we are heading into right now, because Canada is, as I say, in a very precarious situation.
You wrote something here, and I must confess that when I read this sentence, I said, what the heck's he saying? And you don't want this, if you were still my boss, you wouldn't want to be saying, you would be saying in my ear right now, Paikin, this interview's a bit too sweet. Get in his kitchen and rough him up a little bit here. So here we go. You wrote, neither China nor the Chinese people are responsible for COVID-19. How can you say that?
Well, I don't think that that's a particularly controversial thing to say.
Sure it is. The thing started in China, and it was created in the wet markets of China.
Well, yeah, but it was a biological phenomenon, a naturally occurring. I mean, unless you believe that it was some kind of secret weapon, Steve.
I don't.
That happened to. Okay, so you don't. All I was saying is that the actual biology and the genetics of the virus cannot be laid at the feet of China, of the government, or the Chinese people. What I go on to say, though, is that the spread of it and the initial attempts by the Chinese government to tamp down, to dissemble, to not be honest about what happened was the original sin of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So I do blame the Chinese government, not the Chinese people, for the way and the manner in which this was handled. The actual virus, I don't blame on China or the Chinese people.
You don't think it's how do I put this? I mean, the virus started in China. SARS started in China. Coincidence? I guess a lot of epidemiologists don't think so.
No, I mean, again, fine. We can have a discussion about whether or not there should be a closing of wet markets.
That's what I'm getting at.
Okay, yes, for sure. But I mean, I believe that there was a swine flu that began in the United States. I don't blame Americans for swine flu. I believe I'm getting that right. So you want to check that before quoting me on that, although I just quoted myself. That's all I meant. I mean, just that, sure, let's have those wet markets cleaned up. I don't want to see these things around anymore. I was trying to make the distinction between the actual virus and the way that the virus spread around the world.
I gotcha.
Okay.
You also said, you said something else. Well, you said a couple of things that, again, if you were still working in journalism, you never would say, you wouldn't be allowed, you wouldn't get away with saying something like this, but here you go. You said right now China is able to dominate the world in the way that it is because the U.S. is particularly inward-looking right now, and in your words, flirting with fascism. You really think the U.S. is flirting with fascism right now?
I think that there are elements within the United States right now that are flirting with fascism. Yes, I think that um, fascism doesn't only have to look like Nazism, right? It is entirely possible that the 21st century flavor of fascism could look something very different than 1930s Germany and 1940s Germany. Mm-hmm. And there are very worrying signs in the United States of wholesale rejection of liberal beliefs and liberal institutions. I don't believe that the United States right now is a fascist country. I said it is flirting with fascism, mm-hmm. right? And yeah, I do believe that the nationalist populism that we are seeing right now bumps up against the edges of fascism in a 21st century variant. Mm-hmm. Do I think the United States is going to become a fascist country? No, and I certainly hope not. Because I do believe that the world needs a global power that is a liberal power, because the alternative is really too awful to contemplate.
And just to be clear, when you say liberal, you don't mean big L, you mean liberal small as in liberal democracy. Yeah, small L. Yeah. Okay, last question here, and you do something that you would never be allowed to do if you were still in journalism, and that is you openly wish for the defeat of Donald Trump, a view which I guess you share with about 60% of Americans and maybe 85% of Canadians. If that happens and Trump is defeated in November, how does it affect China's plans around the world?
Oh, that's a good question. As you always say, you don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a crystal ball. Look, the period from 1990 to 2010 is finished. The period of an American hegemonic power where it has no serious rivals and no competitors militarily, politically, economically, culturally, and I use the term broadly, is done, right? The question is what will emerge, as I alluded to earlier. Are we going to be in a multipolar world or a bipolar world? I don't think that if Joe Biden wins, which increasingly seems to be the case, but who knows, that we are automatically going to go back to what the world looked like in 2015, prior to Donald Trump getting elected in 2016. I mean, if you remember, the Obama years were also marked by a relative decline of American power vis-a-vis other powers in the world as well. And that's not a slight against either Obama or Trump. It is just a reality, right? I don't think that you can turn back the clock, or that Joe Biden, more importantly, can turn back the clock. The question is, how will the United States manage this relative decline? For the foreseeable future, the United States will remain the largest power in the world, economically, militarily, culturally, although the Trump years really have hurt it culturally, broadly understood. So by culture, I mean soft power, right? The ability to attract. And there will be a lot of work to do for Biden or in a post-Trump era should Trump lose. I do believe that begins with rebuilding alliances, reassuring friends, being very clear with strategic competitors, rebuilding the State Department, and things like that. But we're in a different. We're not in Kansas anymore, and we will see. And as I said, this is an especially tricky time for Canada, a medium-sized power, which has historically relied on a great power for its economic growth and for protection. This is a tricky time, and we will see what happens.
Well, I'm happy to have had this conversation with you, and I'm also happy to recommend your article in the July-August edition of the LRC, the Literary Review of Canada. And I hope to see you somewhere down the road as well, pal.
Thank you, Steve. Pleasure talking with you.
Not at all. And if I can figure out how to stop this thing recording, I'll get it up on social media ASAP. Take care, Dun.
Bye-bye.